the summer heat in the American South could be unbearable, especially for men used to the cooler climates of Northern Europe. Yet in the early 1940s, thousands of German soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire in places like Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, not as conquerors, but as prisoners. Captured on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe, they had been shipped across the Atlantic under guard deposited into camps built quickly on American soil. These were men who had once believed in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, and now they were bewildered, stripped of their weapons, their uniforms exchanged for standard prisoner attire marked with PDU. What they encountered in the United States would not only surprise them, but in many cases leave them questioning everything they had been taught. At first, life in these camps seemed straightforward. Confinement, surveillance, the dull routines of captivity. They expected brutality, or at least harsh neglect. Many remembered horror stories of how prisoners were treated in both world wars, and they braced themselves for hunger punishment and humiliation. Instead, they were met with a system governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States followed with remarkable discipline. The rules required humane treatment, adequate shelter, and proper food. The Germans quickly realized they were going to be fed better than they had been on the front lines. They would have access to libraries, religious services, and even organize. In Germany, propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless capitalists, heartless profiteers who exploited the weak. German soldiers captured in battle had imagined that captivity meant idleness, a stagnant existence until the war's end. But America faced its own challenges. Millions of young American men were overseas, and the nation's workforce had been hollowed out by mobilization. Farmers struggled to har. The first time groups of German prisoners were marched out of the camps and onto American farmland, their shock was evident. Many of them had grown up on farms in Bavaria or Saxony, accustomed to hard labor, but they never imagined they would be tending crops in Texas or picking fruit in California. Local communities initially resisted the idea, worried about armed enemies in their midst. But soon, farmers realized these prisoners were disciplined, hard-working, and skilled. The arrangement was a strange one. Men who had once carried rifles against the Allies now carried baskets and tools, helping to keep America's agricultural machine alive. In many cases, they were treated with a surprising degree of civility by their American overseers. Farmers would share a cigarette, a cup of coffee, even a slice of pie with the very men whose comrades had once fought ag. What stunned the Germans most of all was not just the work itself, but the fact that they were being paid. The Geneva Convention allowed for a wage modest by American standards, but astonishing for men who thought they would languish in prison with nothing. Each prisoner received credit for his labor, often around 80 cents a day, which could be used to buy toiletries, writing paper, candy, or even extra food at the camp canteen. For those who saved their wages, there was the possibility of sending money home through the International Red Cross, easing the burden on families struggling under Allied bombing campaigns and the scarcity of wartime Germany. Imagine the shock of a mother in Hamburg opening a parcel funded by her son's earnings in an American camp while she lived in ruins created by the war he had fought for. This system created bizarre and almost surreal contrasts. German soldiers, once sworn enemies, now stood side by side with American civilians in fields exchanging words in broken English and German, sharing human moments that transcended the war. Many of the Germans discovered that the enemy was not the barbarian they had been warned about, but ordinary people, farmers, mechanics, laborers' families, who treated them with a respect that shook their assumptions. The war had dehumanized the adversary, but captivity in America restored that humanity in unexpected ways. Still, the situation was not without tension. Some Americans were outraged to see German prisoners apparently benefiting from their labor, eating decent food, even laughing in camp concerts, or playing soccer on makeshift fields. Families who had lost sons in North Africa or Normandy could not understand why the very men responsible for their grief seemed to live in relative comfort. The War Department justified it as both a moral duty and a practical necessity, keeping the prisoners healthy, busy, and disciplined, reduced escape attempts, lowered security costs, and made productive use of idle manpower. From the perspective of the prisoners, though, this was more than just survival. It was a glimpse into a different kind of life, one that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian rigidity of their homeland. On the farms and in the factories, they saw women working independently. Communities operating with freedoms they had been denied, and a society that, despite its flaws, did not appear to be collapsing under the strain of war. For many of them, especially younger soldiers raised under Nazi propaganda, it was an awakening. When night fell and they returned to their camps, clutching their small wages or a bar of American chocolate purchased from the canteen, they would talk quietly among themselves. Some wondered aloud if the war had been worth it. Others, with a mixture of guilt and longing, admitted that they might prefer to stay here rather than go home to a shattered, uncertain Germany once the fighting ended. It was a thought that seemed almost treasonous, yet it was growing more common as the months wore on. This was only the beginning of a remarkable chapter in the story of German prisoners of war in America, a chapter where the simple act of working, of being paid for one's effort, began to alter perspectives, soften hearts, and plant seeds of a future many never expected. The irony was inescapable. Men who had been taken prisoner in battle found in captivity something they had rarely known in war itself, a sense of dignity, purpose, and surprisingly hope. As the war stretched on and German prisoners continued to arrive in the United States, the work programs expanded in ways few had anticipated. What began as a temporary solution for farm labor shortages became an organized system that touched nearly every corner of the country. In the Midwest, German POWs harvested wheat and corn under the vast American sky, their sweat mingling with that of American farmers who had never imagined they would rely on enemy soldiers to save their crops. In the South, they worked cotton fields and orchards, and in the West, they were sent to logging camps and canneries. There was a surreal quality to it all, and who had once faced off against American troops in Tunisia or Sicily now stood ankle-deep in mud-cutting sugarcane for the American market. The labor was demanding, but not cruel. Many prisoners noted that the treatment they received from American supervisors was firm, yet respectful, a stark contrast to the brutal discipline of the German military. Some guards even joked with them, or offered small kindnesses like a cigarette or an extra portion of food at the end of the day. The pay remained modest, yet in camp life it meant far more than money alone. At the canteen, prisoners could buy toiletries, stationery, tobacco, or even American comic books and magazines, which opened a window into a culture far removed from Nazi propaganda. The chance to write letters home with camp-provided paper funded by their own labor created a powerful sense of agency that few prisoners expected to have in captivity. In factories and processing plants, German prisoners worked side by side with American civilians, always under guard, but increasingly treated less as dangerous enemies and more as temporary workers. Women who had taken jobs to fill the wartime labor gap sometimes struck up conversations with the prisoners cautiously, at first, then more openly. Young Germans who had grown up under a dictatorship that strictly controlled interaction with outsiders were suddenly being asked about their families, their villages, and their lives back home. The exchanges were brief, but they lingered in the minds of both sides. For some Americans, it was their first personal encounter with the men they had been taught to fear. For the Germans, it was evidence that the enemy was not a faceless monster, but people with humor, warmth, and an easygoing nature that was disarming. Back in the camps, evenings became a time of reflection and recreation. With their wages, prisoners bought art supplies, musical instruments, or sports equipment. They organized orchestras, staged plays, and fielded soccer teams that competed against each other. American guards often watched in amusement, sometimes even joining in. A photograph from the time might show barbed wire in the background, but the men inside it looked more like college students at summer camp than soldiers captured in war. Yet beneath the light-hearted surface, a deeper transformation was taking place. Many prisoners realized that they were experiencing freedoms and comforts in captivity that their families back home in Germany could only dream of. Not all Americans approved. Local newspapers occasionally ran angry editorials about pampered prisoners living off taxpayer dollars, while American boys bled overseas. Families who had received telegrams announcing a son's death in Normandy or Italy found it galling to hear that German soldiers were eating well, playing soccer, and earning wages. The government responded with careful explanations, emphasizing that the Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment and that the work programs were essential to the American economy during wartime. Officials argued that treating prisoners well would also encourage better treatment for American POWs held by the Germans, though in practice the Axis often ignored those rules. The controversy simmered, but the work continued, for the need was too great and the system too efficient to abandon. For the Germans, the experience of captivity in America left a lasting impression. Letters smuggled or sent through official channels often described not misery, but amazement. They spoke of the vastness of American farms, the friendliness of ordinary people, and the strange feeling of being respected even as a prisoner. Some confessed confusion. How could a nation so wealthy and generous also be the one dropping bombs on their cities? Others began to compare what they saw with what they had been taught. The Nazi regime had portrayed America as decadent, chaotic, and weak. Yet here was order, abundance, and fairness on a scale they had never imagined. The contrast gnawed at them. When the war finally ended in 1945, the process of repatriation began. Trains and ships carried prisoners back across the Atlantic to a Germany devastated by bombing, divided by occupation zones, and stripped of the confidence they had once carried into battle. For many, the return was painful. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered, and the economy was shattered. The contrast with the structured, relatively comfortable life they had known in American camps was overwhelming. Some prisoners wept openly at the sight of their destroyed hometowns. Others clung to small mementos of their time in America, a photograph, a camp-made carving, or a notebook filled with English words they had learned. What surprised American officials was the number of German POWs who expressed a desire not to go home at all. During interviews, many admitted that if given the chance, they would stay in the United States permanently. They had tasted freedom in captivity and found it sweeter than anything they expected to return to in Germany. While regulations required their repatriation, the sentiment was remembered. In the years that followed, thousands of former POWs sought visas to return, and many succeeded. They built new lives in the very country that had once been their enemy, some even marrying American women they had met during their captivity. The legacy of this strange chapter in history endures in the memories of families and in the testimonies left behind. It is a story filled with irony, soldiers captured in war who discovered dignity through labor, who received wages from the enemy, and who came to admire the very society they had fought against. It challenges assumptions about cruelty and vengeance, showing instead that sometimes strength is revealed through generosity and fairness. For America, it demonstrated confidence in its own values. For the Germans, it revealed possibilities beyond propaganda. In the end, the tale of German prisoners working and earning wages in America is not just about labor or economics. It is about the human capacity to adapt to recognize decency even in unlikely circumstances and to reimagine what an enemy can be. The war would end, borders would shift, and nations would rebuild. But for thousands of men who had once marched under Hitler's banner, the memory of America's fields factories and fair pay remained an indelible reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could break through the barbed wire.